My wife died on a Tuesday. By Friday, my son was already measuring the rooms. I'm not going to dress that up or make it easier to hear than it is. I'm 67 years old. I had just buried the woman I loved for 41 years. And while I was still trying to remember how to exist in a world without her in it, my own son was standing in my kitchen with his phone out, talking to his wife about square footage and spring listing windows and the added value of the detached garage. But here's what they never saw coming. Margaret saw it coming. She always did. Her name was Margaret Ann Kowalski, 63 years old when she died. A retired grade 4 teacher with dark hair and a laugh she kept mostly to herself, and a way of listening to you, really listening, that made you feel like the most important person in the room. I met her at a dinner party in Kitchener in 1982. I was working as a site supervisor for a construction company. She was teaching school and had opinions about everything, and apologized for none of them. There wasn't really a dance floor at that party. Didn't stop me from asking. Didn't stop her from saying yes. That was Margaret, someone who said yes to the unexpected and meant it every time. We spent 41 years building a life together. The house in Oakville, the savings, the routines that become invisible until they're gone, the Sunday morning coffee, the way she hummed when she was reading, the sound of her moving around in the kitchen at 6 in the morning before the rest of the world was awake. We had our son Derek in 1986, and then there was Owen, my late brother Frank's boy, born in 1989, who grew up in and out of our house after Frank passed. Margaret never treated Owen like a guest or a charity case or anything other than hers. She packed his lunches when his mother was working nights. She drove him to hockey practice in the dark. She showed up to his university graduation already tired in ways she wasn't fully admitting yet, and she stood there in the parking lot afterward with a smile that cost her more than any of us realized. That was who she was. She gave without keeping count, and she never once made you feel the weight of it. Derek loved his mother. I believe that. But Derek loved her the way people love things from a distance, from Calgary, from a comfortable remove, through phone calls on birthdays and visits at Christmas. Owen loved her the way you love someone who is standing right in front of you. The difference matters. It always matters, even when you don't see it until much later. When Margaret got her diagnosis in 2021, Derek started calling more. When she declined faster than any of us expected, he started visiting more. When she passed, he stayed. And that last part is where things started going wrong. The funeral was on a Saturday. By the following Thursday, Pamela, Derek's wife, was asking me whether I had spoken to a financial advisor lately. She nodded slowly when I said I hadn't, in the way you nod at someone who has just said something concerning. That same week, Derek asked if I had considered simplifying my arrangements. Simplifying. I was 67 years old, retired from construction management, perfectly healthy, living in a paid-off 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood. I didn't know what there was to simplify. I found out soon enough. 10 days after Margaret's funeral, Derek sat me down with charts on his phone and explained that the house represented an underperforming asset. He said that for a man my age, living alone, maintaining a property this size was a liability. He said there were beautiful communities for active seniors where I would have everything I needed in one place and people my own age to spend time with. He had already researched a place called Lakeview Pines. He showed me photos of the lobby. He said it the way you say something you've already decided, not something you're proposing. I told him I wasn't moving to a retirement community. I told him I was 67, not 97. I told him I had just lost his mother and I wasn't going anywhere. He let it go for about a week. Then Pamela came by on a Thursday when Derek was at a work meeting. She brought a casserole, which I appreciated. She asked if she could take a look at the upstairs bathroom because she'd noticed the grout looked like it might be going. I said, sure, go ahead. That seemed normal. That seemed like something a person does. I found out later from Owen, who has always had a talent for being present without being noticed, a quality that has served him well, that Pamela hadn't stopped at the bathroom. Owen had watched from the yard while she stood on the back deck with her phone, turning slowly in a full circle, photographing the property like she was conducting a listing appraisal she'd already been hired for. When I asked her about it directly, she said she was just trying to help me understand what deferred maintenance might look like to a future buyer. She used the phrase, future buyer, so naturally, so easily, that I understood it had been in her vocabulary for some time. I started paying closer attention. Years ago, when Margaret had her first health scare and the doctors thought it might be her heart, she and I had added Derek's name to our joint account as a secondary holder. A precaution, a practical measure for a practical fear. The health scare turned out to be nothing. The access remained. In December, I noticed a transfer, $3,000, moved to an account I didn't recognize. I called the bank. The transaction had been authorized from an IP address in Calgary, Derek's address. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time without moving. Then I called Owen. He went quiet in the way he does when he's thinking hard, that particular silence that used to belong to his father and somehow transferred to him. And then he said, "How long do you want to wait before you do something?" I said, "Long enough to know how much." Over the next 6 weeks, I watched carefully. The transfers were small, irregular, spaced out in a way that suggested someone who had thought about what draws attention and what doesn't. By mid-January, the total had reached $67,000. And then one afternoon, I came back inside through the side door, not hiding, just quiet, and I found Pamela in the hallway on her phone. She didn't hear me come in. She was saying that once the house listed, the timeline would take care of itself. She didn't say the timeline for what. She didn't need to. I stood in the hallway for a moment, and then I walked back to my office, and I called Barbara Finch. Barbara has been my lawyer since 2003. She is not a warm woman. She is, however, the most thorough person I have ever worked with. And in a situation like this, thoroughness is worth more than warmth by a significant margin. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about her. And then she said something I hadn't expected. "Harold, I think it's time I told you about the property your wife registered in her name in 2019. I was quiet for a moment. "Margaret told you about that?" Margaret updated her estate planning with me last March. She was quite clear about what she wanted. I assumed you knew the specifics. I knew some of it. Margaret had mentioned the property to me once, the way she mentioned many things she'd done quietly and capably while I was looking elsewhere. A place she'd found up near Tobermory on the Bruce Peninsula. Something she'd bought with an inheritance from her aunt, who passed in 2018, and with savings she'd accumulated over years in an account I didn't know the full details of. She had mentioned it the way you mentioned something you've handled. "I found something," she said, "something for later." I hadn't asked enough questions. I thought later was a feeling. It was an address. A 3-bedroom cedar log house on 4 acres of forested land, 8 minutes from the harbor in Tobermory. A wood stove and a well and a screened porch facing north toward Georgian Bay. Margaret had bought it outright in September 2019, $340,000, cash. She had registered it solely in her name. In her estate, it passed solely to me. Derek was not mentioned anywhere in connection with that property. The life insurance, which I had insisted on when we were young, and she had maintained faithfully through all the years between, had been updated in March of the previous year. Primary beneficiary, me. Secondary beneficiary, Owen. Derek was not listed. Barbara had helped Margaret draft all of it. The will was airtight, every document in order. Margaret had done this quietly, carefully, without telling me the full scope of it, because she understood something I hadn't yet seen clearly. She had known her son. Not necessarily the exact scale of what he would do. Maybe she hoped she was wrong about that. But she had known the direction of things. She had loved him anyway. And she had protected me anyway. The two things existed in her at the same time without contradiction, because that was the kind of person she was. I sat with that understanding for a long time. I still sit with it sometimes. It is one of the greatest acts of love I have ever been on the receiving end of, and I wasn't even aware it was being built. I did not tell Derek any of this. What I did was call a locksmith. On a Wednesday morning while Derek and Pamela were at lunch in Mississauga, I had every lock in the house changed. Front door, back door, side entrance to the garage. I contacted the bank and with Barbara's help, removed Derek's access from the joint account entirely. The remaining funds, less what I needed for current expenses, were moved to an account in my name only. Then I started packing. Not everything at once. I was methodical about it, the same way I'd been methodical about everything I'd built over 40 years in construction. You don't start with the walls, you start with the things that can't be replaced. Margaret's photographs went first. Her books, the cedar box from her dresser that held the letters we'd written each other before email, made letters feel unnecessary. Those went into the first boxes. Then my tools, my files, the papers, the practical things. A small moving company out of Hamilton, Owen's recommendation, reliable and quiet, came on 3 separate weekends. And while Derek and Pamela believed I was still thinking things over, still weighing my options, still considering the Lakeview Pines lobby photos, I moved the better part of my life 4 hours north. The log house near Tobermory was empty and cold when I arrived the first time. February, the kind of quiet that only exists when you're surrounded by trees and water, and there's no traffic, no neighbors, no sound of the city beneath everything. I walked through the rooms slowly. The wood stove in the main room, the kitchen with its deep window over the yard, the screened porch facing north where the birches caught the gray light. And then I found the note, tucked into the kitchen window frame, as if she'd left it there knowing I would arrive alone and need something to hold on to. 3 sentences. I won't write them here. They're mine, and some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will tell you that I sat on that porch for 2 hours after reading it, looking out at the February sky above the tree line, with the note folded in my hands. And for the first time since the Tuesday she died, I understood in my body, not just my mind, that I was going to be all right. Margaret had always been ahead of me. I just hadn't known by how much. Derek called in late January to inform me, not ask me, inform me, that he and Pamela had spoken to a real estate agent and were thinking April would be the ideal listing window for the Oakville house. He said it the way you report a decision that has already been made, a schedule that's already been set. He mentioned the agent was Pamela's cousin and had a strong track record in the West End. He said they were looking at strong numbers. I let him finish. "And when were you planning to tell me the house was for sale?" I asked. "Dad," he said, with that tired, impatient tone he developed, as though I were the one being unreasonable in this situation. "We've talked about this. You can't stay in that house indefinitely." "You're right," I said. "I'm not in that house. I moved out 3 weeks ago. I've been in Tobermory since the 2nd week of January." The pause that followed was long enough that I almost repeated myself. "What? Why would you go to Tobermory? Where are you staying?" "My house," I said. "Your mother's house. The one she left to me. The one you were never going to inherit." The silence after that had a different quality. It had weight in it. I told him about Barbara. I told him about the bank records, the transaction logs, the IP addresses, the $67,000 that had moved out of the joint account from Calgary between December and January. I told him about Pamela on the back deck with her phone. I told him about the phone call I had overheard in my own hallway, about timelines and listings. I told him I had documentation for all of it, and that Barbara had already drafted correspondence if it came to that. And then I told him I didn't want it to come to that. I told him I wanted him to understand what his mother had understood about him, and I wanted him to make a choice about what kind of person he was going to be going forward. But I needed him to understand clearly that the house in Oakville was going to sell on my timeline, through my agent, and that the proceeds belonged entirely to me. And if I chose to give him anything at all from any of this, it would be a gift freely given, not a debt, not an obligation, not something he was owed. The line was quiet for so long I checked to see if the call had dropped. "She knew," he said finally. His voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Mom knew. Your mother knew you," I said. "She loved you anyway. That was her decision to make. What happens next is yours." I hung up. I went inside and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the birches in the snow, and I let myself feel the full weight of it for a few minutes. The grief and the relief, and the strangeness of being in a house that Margaret had built in secret, out of love, out of foresight, out of something that might have been a quiet kind of prayer that I would find my way here. Then the kettle boiled, and I made my coffee, and I moved on with the day. Owen came up that weekend. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in his battered Civic with a bag of groceries and no announcement, which is exactly his way. We walked the property together in the late afternoon light, through the white birches at the back of the lot, down toward the creek that runs along the eastern edge. The snow was still thick in February, and our boots punched through the crust with every step, and for a while we didn't say much. Owen had always had Margaret's comfort with silence. He never felt the need to fill it, which is a quality I hadn't fully appreciated until now. When the quiet was shared with someone who understood it, it stopped being lonely. "She picked a good one," Owen said eventually, looking out at the tree line. "She had good taste," I agreed. We went back inside and I made dinner, and we sat by the wood stove and talked about Frank, which we hadn't done properly in years, and about Margaret, and about what I was thinking of doing with the property going forward. There was a neighbor about a half-mile down the road who ran a small outfitting operation. Kayak rentals, guided hikes, that kind of thing for the summer tourists. She had mentioned that the extra acreage on the eastern side might be useful to her. There were conversations to be had. There were things to figure out. I had spent 40 years overseeing construction, and I understood the satisfaction of a thing that holds together over time. And I was beginning to understand that the same principles applied here, in this second life that Margaret had quietly built for me while I wasn't looking. Barbara handled the Oakville sale that spring on my behalf. It sold in April, just as Derek had predicted, though not through Pamela's cousin. The numbers were what they were after 41 years in that neighborhood. A paid-off home in Oakville is worth something significant. From the proceeds, I transferred $50,000 each to Derek and to Owen. Owen called when the transfer arrived. He was caught off guard. He said he didn't know what to say. I told him it was what Margaret would have wanted, and I meant that completely. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said thank you in a way that told me he was crying. That was Frank's way too, when something got past his defenses. I was glad Owen had kept it. Derek called a day later. "I'll give him this. He didn't thank me in a way that suggested he thought he deserved it. He just said he was sorry. He said it once, plainly, and the plainness of it felt more honest than anything he'd said in months. I told him Tobermory was beautiful in July if he ever wanted to come up. I told him his mother would have liked showing it to him. I left the rest unsaid. Some things a person has to arrive at on their own. There are limits to what a father can do, and I had made my peace with those limits a long time ago. Pamela. I did not call. I had nothing to say to Pamela. I'm writing this on the screen porch in the middle of August with a coffee that is actually hot this time because I have finally learned to sit down before I pour it and not wander off to do something else first. The light off Georgian Bay in the mornings has a quality I have not found anywhere else in 67 years. Something about the angle of it and the water and the way the birches at the edge of the property catch it just before it reaches the porch. Margaret would have painted it. She had been taking watercolor lessons in her last years. I used to tease her about it, gently, because teasing her gently was one of the privileges of 41 years. And she had gotten genuinely good. Better than she admitted. 4 of her small paintings hang in the hallway now, framed in the simple wooden frames she would have chosen herself. I walk past them every morning on the way to the kitchen. I don't always stop, but I always see them. Owen is driving up next weekend with a friend, a young woman from Hamilton who works in environmental assessment and is apparently very interested in the creek ecosystem along the eastern edge of the property. I told Owen she was welcome to look at whatever she wanted. The more people who understand what's here, what's worth preserving, the better. There's a town council meeting in September about a proposed development further up the peninsula. The neighbor who runs the outfitting operation asked if I'd come and speak. I spent 40 years in construction, and I understand both sides of it, what gets built and what gets lost in the building, and how rarely those two things are given equal weight in the same room. I think I have something useful to say. I think I'll go. I still talk to Margaret, not always out loud. Mostly it's internal, a kind of ongoing conversation that happens somewhere between thinking and feeling. But on the long walks, when the birches are doing something particular with the light and there's no one around, I'll say something. A comment about the deer tracks in the mud near the creek. Something I read that she would have had a sharp opinion about. A joke she would have seen coming and laughed at anyway, out of generosity. I don't know with any certainty whether she can hear me. I'm not a man who holds strong opinions about what happens after, and I distrust certainty in both directions. But the habit of talking to her helps me understand what I think, and I suspect that was always part of what she was for me. Not a function. She was far more than that. She was everything. But part of the daily working architecture of love is that it helps you understand yourself. You get used to having someone who knows you completely. When that person is gone, you have to learn to hold still in a different way, to find your own footing on ground that used to hold two people. I'm learning. The kettle is on inside. Another round of coffee. Another hour of this clear August morning before the day gets away from me. And then there's fence line to check on the north side, where something has been getting into the compost, and a section of the screen porch where one of the panels needs recaulking before the cold comes, and a dozen small tasks that add up to the ongoing work of keeping something in good condition. I know how to do that. I have always known how to do that. A good life going forward is not given to you. It is not inherited. It doesn't arrive because someone else failed to take it from you, though sometimes that is where the story begins. It arrives because you decide to build it, the same way you build anything that lasts, carefully, slowly, with attention to what's already there, and with real respect for the ground you're building on. Margaret understood that. She had understood it for longer than I knew. She spent 41 years building a life with me, and then when she knew she was running out of time, she built one more thing, quietly, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission, without even fully telling me, and she left it waiting for me to find. I found it. I am grateful every single day that I did. I am grateful that she trusted me to show up, to be the kind of man who would recognize what she'd left and do something worthy of it. That trust, more than the property, more than the Cedar house, more than the savings or the will or any document Barbara ever filed, that trust is the thing I most want to deserve. It is the thing I work toward every morning when I walk past those 4 small paintings in the hallway, every evening when I sit on this porch and watch the light change over the water. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to inherit something from someone else. The ones who end up with something real are usually the ones who understood, somewhere along the way, that the building was always theirs to do. Margaret knew that before I did. She always knew things before I did. I'm just glad I had 41 years to learn from her. And I'm glad, more than I have words for, that she trusted me with whatever comes next.